Matt.
Hey, how are you? You.
I'm good. I am ready to outline some priorities and build some scaffolding because we need to transcend this bullshit.
So how do we get the revolution to sing? So like the strategic priorities, we're going to be referencing a book that we talked about in a prior episode by Erik Olin Wright called How to Be an Anti-Capitalist in the 21st Century. And one of the things that came up in that talk was, how do you actually choreograph the revolution?
What are the priorities? So the thing you identified as what you wanted more of was, well, what order do we do these things? Where's the meat of the how in the how to be an anti-capitalist in the 21st century? I want to dive more into the how business of that. So we're going to attempt to, in this chat, talk a little bit about what our positions are in terms of priorities for building that scaffolding for transcending capitalism. But before we get to those points, we need to recap real quickly the starting points here. So first part is this diagnosis and critique of capitalism. So in Erik Olin Wright's book, How to Be an Anti-Capitalist in the 21st Century, he quickly and briefly outlines a critique of capitalism based on moral values. And he argues that capitalism impedes the fullest realization of the values of equality/fairness, democracy/freedom, and community/solidarity.
And these are the things that capitalism promises us. So it's part of its mythos. I mean, he's attacking the very thing that it uses to justify its continued, centuries-long existence, is that it does provide fairness, it does provide freedom, it does provide community. Now, Wright and us and others that are socialists would say, no, hell no, it does the exact opposite.
Capitalism is a pyramid scheme built on lies. So it always tells you the exact opposite.
Yeah, it's doublespeak, to use the expression from 1984 by George Orwell. It is really an economic ideology of doublespeak.
And capitalism, as Erik Olin Wright argues, cultivates competitive individualism and privatized consumerism. So his argument about capitalism is basically that the rules of the game of capitalism say that everyone must compete for private gain.
We're just like we're all fucking dragons trying to get our own gold in our lair, and just we don't actually share that lair or even have good conversations. Like, look at all the fucking gold on my castle.
Yes, give me more. A couple of weeks ago, we offered this defining principle of capitalism. What makes it so awesome as a simple program for organizing the entire world is that it is built on the extraction of value for personal wealth based on exclusive claims to resources. How's it working out?
Yeah, it's a fucking shit show. It's a fucking shit show.
It's just fucking idiotic, too. It's fucking stupid. Capitalism needs to manufacture inequality to keep functioning. Its fundamental basis is one of inequality.
It's an inequality generating machine.
Yeah. More than Erik Olin Wright's diagnosis, it's good to have a mixtape about our critique of capitalism. So we also need to recognize, too, that it's always racial capitalism. It's always based on racialized practice. As Ruth Wilson Gilmore so succinctly put it, capitalism requires inequality and racism enshrines it.
And that's from Abolition Geography and the Problem of Innocence in the Futures of Black Radicalism book. So that's been quoted and cited during the uprisings of George Floyd as a key hallmark in thinking about why and how we should link those things together.
I would also add to that not only does capitalism require inequality and racism enshrines it, but also that patriarchy reinforces it, and fame, pursuit of celebrity, sells it. These compounding systems of hierarchy interacting with each other, with capitalism as the engine of those hierarchies.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would add is I always think that the root source of capitalism's outflow is really patriarchy, that patriarchy is the goblin chalice that holds the liquid of capitalism. So it's reinforced both in the front end and the back end of its consumption.
So it does not produce equality, democracy, and community. It produces violence, waste, and misery. Good job, capitalism. Billions of lives ruined and one planet destroyed.
My hat's off to you, Captain Capitalism.
Good fucking job.
Steamboat over that waterfall, please.
So obviously, fuck capitalism, right? We need to be working towards an alternative.
Socialism, baby.
Whispers of socialism.
It's like the horse whisperer, except it comes with lots of good things like healthcare. I'm riding on my horse and it has healthcare with it.
In his book, How to Be an Anti-Capitalist, Erik Olin Wright puts forward a vision of democratic socialism as a means toward human flourishing. I think that's a good...
It's a phrase we've used even back in 2017 with the podcast. Yeah. The idea of not just a dignified life, but a full expansive flowering of people.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember that the 60s came about because young people for the first time in modern American history could self-actualize on the higher end of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so not surprisingly, they're able to think deeper about society and their relationships. The Black Panthers started as a reading group at UC Berkeley. So the most important edge of the Black revolutionary spirit of the 60s starts as a reading group at UC Berkeley. And historic numbers of African-American young people coming from working class families go to college. And so you're starting to see this ferment that comes as a result of some level of a social democracy in the United States for the first time.
This notion of democratic socialism as a means or socialism as a means toward human flourishing is entirely consistent too with the way we've been talking about it in these idea shapes of the golden square as a foundation on which to aim for the utopian sphere. Not that socialism is envisioned necessarily as the state of flourishing, but as a means towards human flourishing, right? As a stepping off point, as a necessary basis for getting to our
or what we call the utopian
future.
Sphere. Yeah, that once we hit the dignified aspects of life and the guaranteed rights that come with a golden square, that then we can start thinking in more emancipatory aims about other social problems like beauty or fame or sexual inequality in terms of how many people get affection and who don't. What does family look like? Those sorts of things become big questions about society.
All the qualitative mess.
Exactly. And the golden square really covers the material needs. The material needs.
In Erik Olin Wright's arguments, socialism is a way to create the material and social means for human flourishing through the realization of those values that capitalism purports to help us fulfill, but fails in reaching of equality.
And it's only socialism that will maximize those values.
Yeah.
So of equality, fairness, democracy, freedom, community, solidarity. So both sides of that mirror. And so you have to make sure that you can maximize them. And Wright is saying essentially that socialism is the only one that can actually generate and maximize those things because what we call the decommodifying process. We're taking basic material needs and decommodifying them and recreating the commons, right?
Yeah.
We have the enclosure of the commons as the building blocks for capitalism. Now we need to do the opposite. We need to recreate the commons. So instead of privatizing consumption, we move to library socialism. Consumption becomes a collective organized experience instead of a process of illogical hoarding, and where consumption is generated in a kind of ethics and an ethos of sharing.
Yeah, we need to democratize and decommodify so we can build the golden square. As an antithesis, as an equally simple principle for organizing a complex world, that the universal rights to food, shelter, healthcare, and education must be guaranteed and provided to all.
That is not only the new human rights, but that's the legitimacy at which you grant any state rights to state actors, is their social contract to the citizens is their ability to generate and provide those basic necessities. So it's a no bullshit blueprint for socialism, the golden square.
An opposing principle defines the golden square, our collective responsibility to provide all people with the material means to live a dignified life. How about we build a world based on that notion?
It's dumbfoundingly obvious as a choice. There is no other choice that meets the day and the needs of the day. And so socialism is the cry de core, is what we should be organizing around, and that the golden square becomes the talking point between our neighbors and our friends about what a just society should look like. It's morally, practically, and economically and ecologically superior in every possible way.
Yeah. Obviously, we're still stuck in an era where a scarcity mindset predominates. That under the rule of the hegemony built by the ruling elite and their functionaries, we can't even imagine. We're not permitted to speculate about the collective organizing of the world so that we can provide these things without depending entirely on markets. But it's absolutely possible.
And this scarcity is not just about a tick in the composition of capitalism, but it's also hundreds of thousands of years in the making. where we didn't have the technology or the control of agriculture. And even with agriculture, we still had weather patterns with droughts and those sorts of things. So scarcity logic is really rooted in the psychosis of the human brain. And it's something we have to transcend, and we have the technology now, as well as the organizational capacity to have a post-scarcity anarchist outlook on the world. And that it's not just capitalism that has created this scarcity. The feudal system had its own ideas of scarcity. Pre-industrial agriculture had its own ideas of scarcity. And of course, hunter-gatherers, while there was equality among the unequals, there was still the sense that there wasn't enough basic resources. So at the time that we shift from an equality of unequals to unequal inequality, we start to see this formation of scarcity always being attached to the human genome. Like, it's just part of it. And what we need to be doing with socialism is creating post-scarcity conditions, right?
Yeah.
We can do this now. It's not like we have to wait 10 more years. We already have the technology.
We've had it for a long time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And this isn't just because of automation, for God's sakes.
No.
We could have already moved to post-scarcity because it's simply, as Jesse has said in prior podcasts, a design problem. Yeah. The dystopia hellscape that we live in is really badly designed institutions and social relations. And so we just simply need to redesign what we already have to actually have the kind of logical outputs where we can reach post-scarcity.
All of the typical defenses of the status quo, of capitalism as the only reasonable system under which to organize the world, often use all kinds of scare tactics. Long-standing tradition of the 20th century was to deride socialism for being all about creating bureaucracy and state control and tyranny of the state, and a lot of scare tactics, a lot of misapplication, misappropriation of the terms socialism and communism. But in reality, socialism will mean less misery, less bureaucracy, more equality, and more democracy in our world.
And while it's true that there is a tradition of socialism that celebrates and extends bureaucratic cultures, i.e. Maoism, Leninism, there's also been a tradition called anarchism, which has rejected unnecessary bureaucracies, which has looked to root things into participatory budget planning, decentralized communities, direct democracy. There is that other trajectory of socialism. And the one that will achieve the most will be the one that is less bureaucratic, that puts decision-making in a decentralized fashion in the hands of the community that most needs to make those decisions. And so we can see that through a variety of ways that don't involve another turn back to Maoism, Leninism, and Stalinism, that there should be a left movement that's against bullshit jobs, it's against the middle management culture and the professional management class being ensconced in our universities and in our nonprofits, as well as in the corporate boardrooms. There's a hell of a lot of bureaucracy in corporation. Just to ask anyone that works for Apple or Google, for Christ's sakes, it's not like the fucking state governments invented bureaucracy. There's been plenty of corporate bureaucracies.
There are all kinds of potholes, all kinds of landmines placed everywhere for anyone attempting to even think about socialism and to be engaged in discourse about a better world, most of which are misdirects and are just traps.
Deflections.
But it is clear, as Rosa Luxemburg said, our choice is between socialism and barbarism. And fuck this shit. Let's build a socialist tomorrow.
Yes, let's get it going. Let's get it moving on. Is socialism or barbarism? Well, there's just socialism because we just now we're at socialism or extinction. So we've moved up another level with climate change. It's not socialism, barbarism. It's socialism or extinction of mass civilization.
This is barbarism.
Yeah. And once again, it's important to note that many people said this was an unrealistic binary. Up until the 1970s, there was Keynesianism that would be the middle management compromise between labor and capital. But climate change makes Rosa Luxemburg's claim of socialism, barbarism all the truer, because mass civilization, the excessive incompetence of mass industrialization in terms of its relationship to the biosphere, means that the binary is more true than ever, that it is socialism or ecological destruction. So how do we get there, right?
So fuck capitalism, let's build socialism, obviously. Just for a reminder, when you go into the internet and you start to try to find folks organically who are also on the side of socialism, there's all kinds of sectarian discussions about tribal identifications around, are you anarchist or a communist or a socialist or whatever the fuck.
It becomes a discussion of clothing lines. Yeah. And I think that's why the golden score is so illustrative, because I think we get every socialist to agree with these things. And then it becomes a real fight about process, which is really the real history of the left. It's not the end goals. We all agree to communism, but it's really the strategies, the tactics that we're going to be using to get there. Is it going to be through state channels? Is it going to be through localized, decentralized one? Is it going to be a hybrid of that? That's kind of the three kind of angles on that, a dual power notion. And the strategic logics that Erik Olin Wright talks about is something that we're going to really focus on, is like, how do we organize the aspects of eroding capitalism that get a symphony going, right? Yeah. And where we can have a mutual agreement about the process, because that is what has divided the left. If you look at the anarchist revolution in Barcelona, if you look at the kind of civil war of socialists between Peter Kropotkin and Lenin, there's always been this huge civil war inside the left about how to forge an agreement of process. And so I think that's what we're going to try to look at today.
Recapping really quickly, the core argument in Erik Olin Wright's book, How to Be an Anti-Capitalist, he argues for an approach of eroding capitalism. And he identifies historically 5 versions or 5 methods of anti-capitalist struggle. 1, smashing capitalism. 2, dismantling capitalism. 3, taming capitalism. 4, resisting capitalism. And 5, escaping capitalism.
An important part of that, of course, is that he says smashing capitalism doesn't work. He rejects the kind of Stalinist, Leninist, Maoist notion that we're just going to destroy it and something magical will happen. Right. But he's also, at the same time, he's lifting up a strategy of escaping capitalism. So the kinds of things that are considered on the margins of resisting capitalism are actually like participatory budget planning and worker cooperatives and mutual aid clinics and linked up with social movements, that these are actually seen marginal and ephemeral and not maybe substantial to state socialists, but they're actually pivotal for the kind of seedbed for creation. So he really says it's about those 4, right? Yeah. And smashing capitalism isn't really one that he thinks has a lot of merits now, because that's what the 20th century was about.
As he describes it, this uses a game metaphor of the system. And so on the level of the game itself, we have smashing capitalism historically as trying to transcend it altogether, but knock it down and out of the ashes build something new.
People in the street will just magically invent something.
Right.
That's really what it comes down to. I mean, every time you talk to a Leninist or whatever, something magical will happen. I was at Occupy, nothing magical happened.
All for that energy. Like, it is urgent. Oh, yeah, so the urgency of that sort of approach is, I think, necessary.
But you got to have a plan in place. You have to have a plan in place. That's the thing. What did the right libertarians do? The Hayekins, the Milton Friedmans of the world, they had a plan in place. They were waiting to position and put in a series of plans. Right. And we have to do that on the left. This is what that book, Inventing the Future, is about. Is Alex Williams' book, co-edited by Nick Schneider, is the idea that you have to have plans in place. You can't just wait for something magical to happen in the streets.
Yeah. And Erik Olin Wright's work, his whole career of work, as summarized in this book, puts forth an argument for a type of plan. In looking at these modes of anti-capitalist struggle, he argues for combining taming capitalism, which has the objective of neutralizing harms by altering or changing rules of the game, so make capitalism less harmful. Dismantling capitalism, which is also working on rules of the game, but with an aim to move beyond. Resisting capitalism, which is struggles that are engaged in the moves of the game.
Like, for instance, preventing the marketization of something that was in the commons.
Yeah, and escaping capitalism. So taming, dismantling, resisting, escaping, combining those 4 approaches that work on rules of the game and moves of the game to both neutralize the harms of capitalism and to transcend its structures. We combine all of those into a strategy that he calls eroding capitalism. Eroding capitalism works by changing the rules of the game from above in order to facilitate alternatives to capitalist economic relations being built from below in ways that over time erode capitalism. This really is mirrored in the strategy and methods advocated by Black socialists in America, in Cooperation Jackson and Kalea and all of their work that they call a dual power strategy.
Yeah, and definitely. And I think that when you look at what the great work that's being done by Kalea and folks at Cooperation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, is they're doing the best work when it comes to escaping capitalism. I think if we look at a movement that had most of those things involved, it would be Bernie Sanders' presidential run in 2015, but more, I think, in 2020 when he actually explicitly talked about workers owning 20% of corporate profits, and also the expansion of communal land trusts and worker co-ops. More of those escaping capitalism aspects was in his 2020 campaign. And so the left can be unified if we get enough of these things in one place. And that's one claim you can make about electoral politics, is it does tend to bring in all these various strands of socialists. And the left was the most united when Sanders was running president. What has happened since? The massive schisms about Green Party masturbations, or voting for Biden but holding my nose, or trying to play with the party platform. The left is once again in a schism form after Sanders' failed run. And we have to think about, how do we get these things to sync up? Because if we're thinking about strategic priorities, does one come before the other? Do we find a place where all of them meet?
Right.
Because Sanders was the last time we had those four in a symphony. And the left was the most united that I've ever seen in 2015, 16, and 2019 and 20 with Sanders' two runs. And the question is, how do we build that again, not having an electoral process on the national level? It's a good question, because if you're looking for a movement in American history since the dawn of neoliberalism that had combined all of those strategic logics, I would say Sanders' campaign combined the most of them. I would say escaping capitalism wasn't so present in his 2016 run at all. But I would say if you look at the platforms in Bernie's website, you could see escaping capitalism components in that.
Yeah, and there is a good deal of debate, again, on the left about the usefulness of electoral politics and how much and to what degree to engage in or to put hopes in electoral politics. Of course, the two of us have differing sort of positions on that, because I'm probably I have much less patience, I should say, for electoral politics and engaging in that realm. But I don't discount.
Exactly. I don't think we discount dual power strategy.
Yeah,
dual power. And because the dual power mechanism can be looked at in terms of local politics versus folk politics, or local politics and national politics with folk politics, localized democratic movements in the streets. And I think the national politics is just kind of gone now. I'm not like trying to fetishize that, but I'm saying that was a noteworthy moment in the left where there was a general sense of unity. If you meet or online or in person, there's a general sense like, hey, this is something we can believe in. This is an actual path forward. It may not last, but it's a momentary surprise in what is usually pretty shitty, which is national politics.
Yeah.
It's pretty fucking worthless.
Hopefully there is a continuation of some energy on the national electoral politics level with the growing of the squad, as they're called.
Cori Bush having won this last week.
So adding Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman and growing this
it could be the new progressive caucus.
Yeah,
it could be an actual socialist caucus, which is what probably we should be talking about right now rather than a progressive caucus. But like I said, certainly that's the thing. But what we have now, where the leverage is now, is the people in the streets.
Yeah.
Right. That's where we're moving to.
So in terms of the things that erode capitalism, Erik Olin Wright put forward a sort of set of what he termed symbiotic transformations, or real utopias, as he characterized them. And in reading his work, clearly, I think UBI was at the top, but the rest were kind of like all not necessarily prioritized. And
they weren't even really that defined as well. I thought a huge mistake was the lack of sincere discussion on community land trusts. And I thought that would be something that would be much more present, as much as UBI or Medicare for all.
Right.
And I don't think he actually ever talks about Medicare for all as a liberatory model, but I would think it would be.
Not in that book, I don't think. So his list of symbiotic transformations or real utopias to erode capitalism are unconditional basic income, building a cooperative economy, so co-ops and stuff, but thinking about all kinds of models of cooperatives, building the solidarity and social good economy, so the nonprofits and other sort of social solidarity pursuits, democratizing capitalist firms, so making them more pro-union sort of efforts to have more workers, to have more say in capitalist firms.
And also ownership. Yeah,
ownership. Yep. Banking as a public utility, state provision of goods and services, peer-to-peer collaborative production, and growing the knowledge commons. These combined with efforts to democratize the capitalist state through more localized democratic community control, participatory budgeting, election by lot or sortition in certain circumstances, and public financing of elections. So that was his list as gathered together in that book.
In one form, the symbiotic transformations, and then democratizing the capital state, localized democratic community control, participatory budget planning, sortition, and public financing. That's the other category, is that democratizing the capitalist state, and that these things could be synced up in some way. Now, once again, like I said, he doesn't discuss it in Real Utopias, and he doesn't discuss it in his follow-up book, How to Be an Anti-Capitalist 21st Century, is like, how do we get these things ordered? What comes first, or what? Right. We can't put our energy everywhere, right? That's the problem. We can't put our energy everywhere.
We can't. But frameworks are helpful for this. Obviously, the world is complex, and having thinking tools for these can be really helpful in organizing our arguments and building solidarity. So I have a developing theory of emancipatory struggle that helps to inform the way that I think about this. An emancipatory struggle needs to take an abolitionist trajectory. And the model that I use is something that's sort of complementary to what's called the socio-ecological model. The socio-ecological model is a sociological framework that's often used by folks who are engaged in harm reduction work, folks who do work like sexual violence prevention and things like this, that outlines the interacting component parts of a complex world, those parts of the world that define the shape of society, communities, relationships, and individual beliefs, sort of the overlapping, intersecting way, systems thinking way that those things interact to inform our understanding about how people interact with each other in the world. And that how these things might lead an individual to cause another person harm, and therefore how do we go about reducing that harm or preventing that harm, and what to do about it? And so obviously we didn't think of capitalism as a means of producing harm, right? That's what it does, is causes misery in the world and is destroying the planet.
Harm grinder.
It's a harm grinder, yeah. So socio-ecological model is a sort of, think of it as an antithesis to the patriarchal neoliberal ideology that attempts to explain everything in the world as a result of choices of isolated individuals.
Well, that social ecological framework is also, it's centered on care and empathy, right? Mm-hmm. It's centered on potentialities of the person. Yeah. It's not centered on creating a winner or loser society where everybody's getting spanked fucking randomly when they go through the hallway of their house, right? It's, if capitalism is anything, it's just a grinding machine. It grinds everything up. It lets one person use the hand crank on everybody else.
Yeah, one can see that this patriarchal neoliberal kind of ideology that has permeated our culture and has come to dominate the world in the last 40 years as being informed by this whole mythology of heroes versus villains and good versus evil, this long-standing thing that the whole idea of this quote-unquote Cold War was built on. Most of the 20th century look back as sort of good versus evil battles, sort of most poignantly characterized by folks like Joseph Campbell in The Power of Myth, the thing that George Lucas said was the informed Star Wars, right?
Which I jokingly say is kind of like the Francis Fukuyama version of the end of history. There's always good, there's always evil. The only healthy thing is to have them in balance rather than the actual elimination of that evil. So it's actually a reformist logic. It's a traditionalist logic. It's not a revolutionary one.
And then, echoed through the ideologies of Ronald Reagan and assholes like Jordan Peterson currently.
Lobster.
So complementary with the socio-ecological model, my framework goes like this. Our world has been shaped by mythologies of hierarchy, becoming justifications for relations of dominance, which create systems of oppression maintained through institutions of violence. Therefore, we must undo compounding layers of harm concurrently, but in order of priority through 1, abolishing institutions of violence, 2, dismantling systems of oppression, 3, eroding relations of dominance, and 4, erasing mythologies of hierarchy. I think it's important to remember that it's not that capitalism is the only thing that keeps us from a better world. It's just that capitalism is the best engine ever created for maintaining and reproducing the ecosystems of hierarchy, dominance, oppression, and violence that prevent us from building a better world.
And when one thinks of hierarchy, you can think, of course, supplant or put in religion, race, gender. When one thinks of dominance, one can very much think of patriarchy, racism, and celebrity. When one thinks of systems of oppression, one can also think of capitalism, colonialism, and imperialism, and the institutions of violence that create the status quo of these forms of oppression are the police, military, and what Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls the lawfare, the law and order, the other types of warfare that exist through paper and words.
This echoes our idea of the poison pyramid. In early discussions in the podcast, talked about the poison pyramid.
The first 3 episodes of our podcast, we talk about
being sort of as the outline of it being identified through religion, capitalism, and celebrity, sort of describing the outline of the poison pyramid. 3 points, this overlapping systems of...
And I think when we were talking about the poison pyramid, we're talking about the current types of hierarchy generations and mythos that control us. Obviously, I would say patriarchy is one of the earliest manifestations of hierarchy in human society and civilization, but capitalism is its apotheosis through economic forms. And its economic violence is seen through patriarchy, because patriarchy wants to pick winners and losers and wants to reward and control through a winner-take-all system. And so they're not the only forms of a hierarchy in society that are unjust, are the ones that block us when it comes to celebrity and religion. They tend to block our ability to think past the status quo.
So in thinking about undoing compounding layers of harm concurrently, but in priority order, abolishing institutions of violence would mean we will look at state or institutional actors, like you said, police, military, prison industrial complex. When we look at dismantling systems of oppression, we look at state and institutional structures. So those things that keep and codify and segregate us through racist, patriarchal, and capitalist policy making. When we look at eroding relations of dominance, we look at social norms, those reinforcements of hierarchy that happen on a daily basis in our interactions. And when we think about this, most of what we see in progressive, liberal, left kind of discourse is really only aimed at this level of relations of dominance, of the harm that you did to me, the interpersonal dynamics of power relations. So when people talk about identity politics and weaponizing identity politics, it's just about the activity at this level of relations of dominance. And it's okay you keep it there, because as long as you don't do any work to dismantle systems of oppression or abolish institutions of violence, we can spend all the time we want on.
And it's one of the most captivating things between liberals and the left, which we could say are quite different. They're not part of the broader left, is that liberals tend to focus on the private norms of a president rather than the public norms of their policies. So this is why liberals love Obama, because he's so cool to his kids while he's drone bombing everybody. Right. And so these norms of being a president have been violated. The customs and traditions of being the leader of the bourgeois state become entrusted as a place of worship. Like, oh, he spoke in full sentences, and oh, he was so thoughtful when he said those things, even while he deported 3 million people. So that's a kind of interesting thing when you look at eroding relations of dominance. Is these social norms can tell you a lot about what we think are actual norms, right? The everyday interpersonal stuff versus the actual public dilemma of those kinds of things, these kinds of lawfare aspects where we're actually seeing policies that are racist to the core. It's important to remember that we had more African Americans at any time in U.S. history when Obama was president in both the Congress and the Senate, and we still had massive levels of violence and murder by cops. It wasn't like people weren't getting killed by cops. It just kept going. And so you could have these social norms of someone who respects the higher office but still does awful things.
Remember that these relations of dominance are justified by mythologies of hierarchy. And if we're going to really have a functioning emancipatory struggle, we're going to get past all of these. We really got to work on also eventually erasing these mythologies of hierarchy. So these are the ideologies. These are the underlying histories, the stories, the falsehoods that inform all of our collective understanding of the world. These are our belief systems, religion, and so forth.
I think when we look at these categories, these 4 categories that are they're compounding layers of harm, is that they interact with each other in such a way that we can't separate them. And so that's why we're separating them. So you can actually see
them more clearly.
Exactly. Tell the tendon from the bone to the muscle. And that's really crucial in there. And once again, like I said, social norms can mean 2 different things, both the private sphere and the public sphere. It's once again, I think, a key difference between liberals and the left. is that liberals tend to look at the private sphere for their sense of morality, procedure, process-orientated PMC bullshit, versus what I think the left generally looks is what is the policies? How can we do harm reduction through policy? And not obsess about the private lives of politicians.
So this theory of emancipatory struggle, this abolitionist trajectory that diagrams both how compounding systems of oppression have come about and what to do, therefore, to undo them, is informative for me in thinking about what is the strategy. So then how do we build the scaffolding? What are the priorities then in an anti-capitalist project, in aiming to transcend capitalism and aiming to get toward the golden square? So I have what I would call a 4-part policy strategy, a set of strategic priorities for transcending capitalism and building the golden square, getting to a set of conditions where we can build a world based on providing food, shelter, healthcare, and education to everyone as a 4-point compass. So I think of it as a tool to navigate in an anti-capitalist way. 4 points on an anti-capitalist compass, and depending on conditions in the world, we can put one at the forefront, depending on how things are unfolding. First point is eliminating state violence. So these would be projects and priorities to abolish institutions of violence. So defund the police, abolish the police, abolishing prisons and military-industrial complex. The other thing I'd say about this is this anti-capitalist compass is also a sort of bullshit detector. If somebody's position isn't in any of these directions, at least one of these directions, then they're probably selling me some bullshit.
And it's not just a socio-ecological model of harm reduction. It's that while doing harm reduction, you open the channels for street action and mass democracy, because the very things that are doing this violence aren't just doing it to, of course, create harm, but they're also to prevent wider manifestations of mass democracy. So while you attack that violence, you also create the foundations for a flowering of fully felt struggle among our civilization.
The cops, the enforcers of law and order, quote unquote law and order, are the ones keeping us from doing the other necessary things to organize, to build a collective chorus of potentiality toward a different world. Second point is to guarantee social welfare. So these would be projects like universal healthcare, unconditional basic income. The third is decommodify life. So decommodification objectives. So cancel rent, canceling student debt. And fourth, democratize society. So this is primarily getting money out of politics, building forms of democracy like worker-owned co-ops, and so forth. So again, 4 points on this anti-capitalist compass. Strategic priorities for transcending capitalism, I would argue, need to be 1, eliminate state violence, 2, guarantee social welfare, 3, decommodify life, and 4, democratize society.
As one side note, I was wondering if you would think Medicare for All might be part 1 for eliminate state violence. The very lack of health care, is that not only a form of violence rather than just the police, that we can actually seek help when we're sick?
I don't think frameworks like this are meant to be entirely prescriptive or inflexible. They just help provide clarity for this. And I think there are many things that would be combinations of decommodification, social welfare, elimination of violence, and or increasing democracy. There are many things that would be doing all 4 at once. I think we'd identify lots of things that would work towards all of this, like community land trusts and healthcare. We can find aspects that hit all 4 of these. But I think this is identifying potentials and then prioritizing things that would be anti-capitalist in their directionality. This is an anti-capitalist compass.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. For each one of these, currently, I would say there are things that would be the top priority. So in eliminating state violence, I think defund the police. There's been potential for that opened up this summer. In terms of guaranteeing social welfare, universal basic income, probably the number 1 thing I would put there. In the direction of decommodifying life, I'll put canceling rent as the top priority. And in terms of democratizing society, I would put getting money out of politics or public financing for elections as the top thing there. Now, I know for you probably have a different characterization, and money out of politics is probably what you'd see as the primary wedge.
Yeah, exactly. So the primary wedge for me would be money in politics. I think there's a failure in the fact that there's never really a way to emotionalize money in politics unless we're talking about a specific policy issue or outcome like rent or militarization of police or our colonial forever wars or immigration and border relationships. We always have to use those stories, but the most intersectional solution is money in politics because that poisons any possibility on the electoral level from anything meaningful happening. Not just for national politics. People forget that the fucking police unions and the for-profit land barons that want to buy up property are destroying your cities, right? That we have to tell those stories, we have to connect them. And that's why I say money in politics is the most intersectional solution. We can tie all these social justice movements by that one incentive marker, which is the incentive marker for private wealth to reproduce itself through the political forum, right? This is a gladiator ring where money wins. And so while I do agree, it's very hard to emotionalize something as bureaucratic and awful as a poison political funding system. It's important that we still make those connections because we can exponentially expand our ability to win issues if we don't have a squad, but we have a kind of entire field army out on the political field. So it's not just Cory Bush and AOC and sometimes Ayanna Pressley, but mostly, Elon Moore or Rashida Tlaib. So we have to actually have much more people present to push on that. And once again, I'm not to say that one person making it doesn't make a difference. We do know that the DSA member on the city council of Denver was able to actually stop the for-profit prisons that were building up in the city of Denver. So one person can make a change, but with a 10-year climate window, money in politics becomes the basis for how we wage a winning campaign.
And my argument is I think that it has to be part of this compass. I think it's absolutely one of the priorities. And as all of these are, I think a linchpin. And I think it may just be a matter of which linchpin are we going to be able to pull? Is it going to be getting cops off our necks? Is it going to be universal basic income and not having to organize our lives around a 40-hour work week forever? Is it going to be canceling the rent and not having to sell ourselves to land barons for all our life? Or is it going to be money out of politics? We can have a say in the systems of governance.
And I don't want us to be so dogmatic to say that I'm going to make this the issue and everybody has to agree with me. I think we look at the terrain at which things exist right now. Unfortunately, the defund movement's getting less and less attention in the media unless you live in Portland and they want to talk about people being rounded up and put in trucks. Certainly disconcerting by soldiers just rounding up people without badges. But the rent thing is actually happening right now. This is the new crisis after other crises. And so we should look at rent and land in connection to the people who benefit from it and who use the political arena to reproduce their wealth. And so I think it's more important to look at the terrain and what actually exists, what's in the conscious. And certainly the attention to debt cancellation and rent strikes, those are things that we can look at right now and work with while connecting to money in politics.
Two things I want to say in response to that position. One is that the infliction of violence by the state, and I would say state violence is not just police and military and everything we think is official functionaries of the state, but much of what is sexual violence that happens on college campuses under the auspices of collegiate athletics and the Greek system and single gender social groups that harbor and reinforce predatory patriarchal cultures,
especially with these frats where especially with these frat cultures that make sex into competition, right? That's the most corrosive aspect of the frat cultures. They take sex and sexuality and they make it a competition of gladiators.
The elimination of state violence and violence adjacent to state violence, condoned by the state or that the state is unwilling to prevent. Social welfare and decommodifying our lives as more urgent in the day-to-day experience of individuals. And money in politics is an abstract thing. Like you said, it's not the day-to-day conditions, moment-to-moment conditions of my life. It informs it and shapes it. The decisions about what the world looks like obviously shapes it.
And that's why this bureaucratic tragedy has to be emotionally fastened to Medicare for all or rent or student debt cancellation. It always has to be narrated through these sites of suffering. And that's when it's going to work best. And that's why I said it's the political glue for any social struggle terrain, is we keep that as 1/3 of our conversation. Like whenever we talk about demilitarizing the police or our forever wars or the border crisis and the fact that we have a system where students are given massive levels of debt before they turn 22, that we have to always connect that back to at least 1/3 of our claim to the money and politics problems, is that the CARES Act, 80% of it went to people that had the most money in the political system. Right. And therefore, we're able to reproduce their privilege through the political arena. And so I think what's crucial is that we use the terrain as the terrain exists. And I think that's why you put rent and debt, not just the violence of the state, as sources of avenues where we can work at, because that's where the narrative is. But that's also where the terrain is, where the awareness is, where the actual suffering is right now, with 33% or so folks not paying any rent at all because they can't afford it. And so that's a crisis that's building right now. Is African Americans have been trapped in their body through racialized violence and white supremacy, and we've been trapped in our house. Well, guess what? Now we're going to not even have the protection of being trapped in our house as people are thrown out of their house. So I think using that terrain of what's actually happening and organizing on that to build bigger strikes is crucial. So I think rent and debt is an aspect. It's both the physical embodiment of debt is the rent, right? It's like the real-time effects of debt.
As always, we need to be open to changing priorities and tactics in order to take advantage of dynamic circumstances as they unfold. We have to be nimble. There isn't one magic solution. What do they call it? A silver bullet, as they say, for killing capitalism. We need to be nimble. It's important to have a clear understanding of what we're fighting and what we're fighting for. And so having a clear vision and moral integrity, I think, is paramount, regardless of what becomes today or tomorrow, the next day or next year, opportunities for us to open up space to move out of this hellscape.
Yeah, and this is why I say I'm not dogmatic about my approach to money and politics, even though I think it's the core, most logical issue to focus on, because I'm aware of the fact that it lacks the narrative cohesion of sites of suffering, but also that time shifts. Politics shifts, history shifts, and that you have to look at where the terrain is. And if you're a good socialist, you look at where people are mobilizing, you join forces with them. Because you do share their interests.
And I do think, like Kali Akuno said in his essay that we talked about last week, entitled The Floyd Rebellion, Pathway to a Revolution, that we must unite, fight, and build the general strike. I want to just mention really quickly, and we need to come back to this, and we'll spend more time chatting about this, is what are the potential obstacles for transformation? This was the third part of Erik Olin Wright's emancipatory social science methodology, and how he spent the last part of that book we've been referencing is diagramming the problems of transformation. So we have a vision, we have a set of priorities. How do we get there? And he identified the key obstacle as being the problem of collective agency. Usually we talk about building solidarity. Collective agency is like, how do we not only have solidarity, but act in a cohesive, coordinated way? But I think that starts with solidarity. And my thinking is that the clearest, broadest through line that is a biggest potential is rent and debt. That rent extraction and debt peonage are potential threads to connect a broad range of emancipatory struggles and build collective solidarity and collective agency. I think as what I call wage slaves class, we all have shared conditions of entrapment in the extraction pyramid scheme of capitalism. And that, I think, is an arena of potential connectedness for building solidarity for emancipatory struggle.
And what COVID does, I think, so uniquely is it takes persistent problems and tips them over the edge. So, the rent and debt crisis is being tipped over the edge because people can't pay their student loans, people can't pay for the rent. It was already cost burdened, but now it's tipping over the edge with COVID. And so these crises mount after the central crisis of COVID. And so, like I said, that makes sense because it's what the terrain is. It's what's actually happening. We have a major crisis of no unemployment.
Yes. Well, renters of the world, unite.
Unite.
debtors of the world, unite.
And fight back for general strike. That's what we need. 1919, 1946, the last time we had general strikes. And I'm welcome and willing to join one. I'm just waiting for it to happen, right? And we have to ask ourselves that this might be the case. When you have rent as such a major crisis, it's a much larger effect zone than state violence in the form of police. We're talking about people being able to live in their homes.
Yes, the first part of this is building solidarity, so then we can begin to organize collectively. All right, well, I think we have a lot more to say about all this, but and there's more to talk about in terms of understanding class dynamics and obstacles for building solidarity, but we will pick these up in the weeks to come.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Cheers.
Cheers.
What?
I'll do a normal cheers. 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 Like a questioning cheers. I'm a questioning cheers. Cheers.